The Kingdom of the Cults by Walter Martin. Chapter 3. The Psychological Structure of Cultism. It is extremely difficult, when approaching the study of the field of non-Christian cults, to accurately appraise such groups without some knowledge of the psychological factors involved in both their formation and growth. Each cult has what might be called its own belief system, which follows a distinct pattern and, allowing for obvious differences of personality which exist in any group, can be analyzed and understood in relation to its particular theological structure. Since until recently, very little, if anything, has been written on the subject relative to the cults, considerable research was necessary in order to bring this matter under discussion. That it must be discussed and understood as an integral part of the whole complex of the development of American cult systems, no thorough student will deny. In the course of working with cultists, it has been the observation of this writer that each cultist, though different as an individual, does share certain psychological traits in common with his fellow members, and a careful study of these similarities has revealed some interesting trends. It is not possible in one chapter to cover all of the cult systems, so we have limited our observations to Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, and Christian Science. The Jehovah's Witnesses represent those cult systems which put strong emphasis upon eschatology and prophecy. The Mormons, those which emphasize priestly authority, secret rituals, and symbols, and Christian Science, the Gnostic cults, which ground their experience in metaphysical pantheism and physical healing, a fact which contains within itself enough material to merit an entire book on the problem of psychosomatic medicine and healing. Dr. Milton Rokeach, in his illuminating book, The Open and Closed Mind, notes that there are three regions or levels that psychologists generally recognize in any belief or disbelief system. The first, or central region, is that which encompasses the individual's basic primitive outlook on the world in which he lives and asks such questions as, is the world a threatening place, or is it an accepting place? The second, or intermediate region, is the area of authority. In other words, whose authority is a person willing to accept in matters pertaining to the functions of life? Finally, there is the peripheral region, which penetrates into the details of the structure of living. The details may vary or change according to the specific content which the authority, once accepted, may invoke. There is no doubt in my mind that the belief systems of the cults share much in common, and that some of these common factors are worth noting. First and foremost, the belief systems of the cults are characterized by closed-mindedness. They are not interested in a rational cognitive evaluation of the facts. The organizational structure interprets the facts to the cultist, generally invoking the Bible and or its respective founder as the ultimate source of its pronouncements. Such belief systems are in isolation. They never shift to logical consistency. They exist in what we might describe as separate compartments in the cultist's mind, and are almost incapable of penetration or disruption if the individual cultist is completely committed to the authority pattern of his organization. Secondly, cultic belief systems are characterized by genuine antagonism on a personal level, since the cultist almost always identifies his dislike of the Christian message with the messenger who holds such opposing beliefs. The identification of opposing beliefs with the individual in the framework of antagonism leads the cultist almost always to reject the individual as well as the belief, a problem closely linked with closed-mindedness and one that is extremely difficult to deal with in general dialogue with cultists. Theoretically speaking, if one could drive a wedge between the individual or the personality of the individual toward whom the cultist is antagonistic and the theology, which is the real source of the antagonism, it would be possible to deal with the individual cultist by becoming, in his or her eyes, a neutral, objective source of data. The Christian would then become a person who maintains a system of theology opposed to theirs, but not necessarily involved on a level of personal antagonism toward the cultist. Experience has shown me that when this is accomplished, it is the first step in a systematic undercutting of one of the basic problems all cultists face in interpersonal contact, the problem of hostility toward those who reject their interpretations. Such a procedure can go a long way toward allaying hostility, for once a cultist who has been thoroughly brainwashed psychologically by his own authority system, the Watchtower Society, Mrs. Eddy's books, the writings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, etc., is confronted by a Christian whom he can learn to accept on a personal basis, apart from differences of theological opinion, the possibility of communication improves markedly. In effect, the cultist is faced with a dilemma. How can this person, the Christian, be such an acceptable personality, yet not share his, the cultist's, theology? The cultist, then, quite often begins to wonder how it is possible for the Christian to accept him as a person and yet not accept his beliefs. This can be the beginning of rapport in the realm of personal evangelism. Since almost all systems of authority in cult organizations indoctrinate their disciples to believe that anyone who opposes their beliefs cannot be motivated by anything other than satanic force or blind prejudice and ignorance, a cultist's encounter with Christians who do not fit this pattern can produce startling results. A discerning Christian who gives every indication of being unprejudiced, reasonably learned, and possessed of a genuine love for the welfare of the cultist himself, which is easily detectable in the Christian's concern for his soul and spiritual well-being generally, can have a devastating effect upon the conditioning apparatus of any cult system. Above all else, Christians must learn that most cults consider that they have freed their adherents from religious exploitation, which they almost always accuse historic Christianity of practicing. In this connection, it becomes a vital necessity to demonstrate genuine interest in the cultist as a person, for the sake of himself and his personal redemption, rather than as a possible statistic for any given denomination. The prime task of Christians who would be effective witnesses for Christ in the midst of the kingdom of the cults is that they be free from all appearance of guile and ulterior motivation, remembering that our main task is to communicate to those who are by their very adherence to cultic systems of belief in virtual isolation from the Christian message. This isolationism, which can be extreme, must be considered in preparing one's presentation of the gospel to a cultist. It is a very real mental and emotional chain which has a strong hold on the cultist's ability to discern truth from error, light from darkness. If the tragedy of Jonestown on November 18, 1978, when over 900 cult followers of Reverend Jim Jones committed forced suicide, has taught us anything, it has taught us the despair and isolationism of cultists. The following quote from People's Temple, People's Tomb, Phil Kearns with Doug Weed, Plainfield, New Jersey, Logos International, 1979, page 205, illustrates this graphically. A sealed note found on the cult commander's body, apparently written by a follower just prior to the ritual suicide, gave additional credence to this theory. "Dad," the note said, "I see no way out. I agree with your decision. I fear only that without you, the world may not make it to communism. For my part, I am more than tired of this wretched, merciless planet and the hell it holds for so many masses of beautiful people. Thank you for the only life I've known. While this volume deals primarily with traditional American cults, and therefore will not treat Jim Jones' People's Temple cult in a separate chapter, it is important for us to remember that the cultic psychological patterns evidenced in manic proportions at Jonestown are present to some degree in each and every cult. Thirdly, almost without exception, all cultic belief systems manifest a type of institutional dogmatism and a pronounced intolerance for any position but their own. This no doubt stems from the fact that in the case of non-Christian cult systems, which wish to be identified with Christianity, the ground for their claims is almost always supernatural. We do not wish to imply that there is no such thing as an authoritative dogmatism which is valid and true, such as the teachings of Jesus Christ, but rather that cult systems tend to invest with the authority of the supernatural whatever pronouncements are deemed necessary to condition and control the minds of their followers. Thus it is that when Joseph Smith Jr., the Mormon prophet, and his successor, Brigham Young, wished to implement doctrines or changes of practice in the Mormon Church, they prefaced their remarks with proclamations that God had revealed to them the necessity of such doctrines or practices among the saints. An example of this was Charles Taze Russell's bold claim that his writings were indispensable to the study of the Bible for Jehovah's Witnesses, and that to study the Bible apart from his inspired comments was to go into spiritual darkness. Russell also taught that concentration upon his writings, even at the expense of studying the Bible, would most certainly lead one into deeper spiritual illumination within 2 years. Mary Baker Eddy also conformed to this pattern by requiring her followers to regard her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, as a divine revelation, and her religion as a higher, clearer, and more permanent revelation than before. Mrs. Eddy did not hesitate to state that she would blush to write of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, as she did, if she, apart from God, were its author. The history of cultism generally begins with an authoritarian pronouncement on the part of the founder or founders. This in turn is institutionalized during their lifetime or after their death into a dogmatic system which requires absolute faith in the supernatural authority of those who received the initial revelation and whose writings and pronouncements are alleged to have transmitted it. Some interesting studies of institutional dogmatism can be found in such books as George Orwell's 1984, Eric Hoffer's The True Believer, and Crossman's volume, The God That Failed. The problem of intolerance is closely linked to institutional dogmatism or authoritarianism, and those systems which embody this line of reasoning are resistant to change and penetration, since the cults thrive on conformity, ambiguity, and extremeness of belief. The fourth and final point in any analysis of the belief system of cults is the factor of isolation. Within the structure of non-Christian cult systems, one can observe the peaceful coexistence of beliefs that are beyond a question of a doubt, logically contradictory, and which in terms of psychological analysis would come under the heading of compartmentalization. In his classic book, 1984, George Orwell describes this as doublethink. Rokeach, commenting on this, illustrates the point admirably. In everyday life, we note many examples of doublethink, expressing an abhorrence of violence, and at the same time believing it is justifiable under certain conditions, affirming a faith in the common man, and at the same time believing that the masses are stupid, being for democracy, but also advocating a government run by an intellectual elite, believing in freedom for all, but also believing that certain groups should be restricted, believing that science makes no value judgments, but also knowing a good theory from a bad theory, and a good experiment from a bad experiment. Such expressions of clearly contradictory beliefs will be taken as one indication of isolation in the belief system. A final indicator of isolation is the outright denial of contradiction. Contradictory facts can be denied in several ways. On grounds of face absurdity, it is absurd on the face of it. Chance, the exception that proves the rule. The true facts are not accessible, and the only available sources of information are biased. Relating this to the belief system of cults, I do not believe it could be stated with greater clarity. Dr. Rokeach has hit the proverbial nail squarely on the head. Jehovah's Witnesses are well aware of the fact that the Watchtower organization, under the leadership of Judge Rutherford, maintained that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would return to Earth before the close of the 1920s, and even bought a home for the patriarchs to dwell in, San Diego, California, Beth Sarim, the House of Princes. At the same time, Jehovah's Witnesses are fully aware of the fact that the patriarchs did not materialize on schedule, yet they cling tenaciously to the same principles of prophetic interpretation which conceived and brought forth the now defunct interpretations of previous Watchtower leaders. How tenaciously they do cling is evident from their latest fiasco, a prediction that the Battle of Armageddon would occur in 1975. It obviously hasn't occurred yet, but faithful Jehovah's Witnesses are still pounding on the doors of America, telling of the light they receive through Jehovah's organization. Well-informed Mormon historians and theologians are equally aware that the first edition of the Book of Mormon and the present edition of the Book of Mormon are quite different in 3,913 separate instances, over 25,000 including punctuation changes. The first edition having been revised and corrected by Joseph Smith and his successors over the last 150 years. Yet both the errors and the revisions of the Book of Mormon are heralded as divine revelation by Mormons. This is another example of the peaceful coexistence of logical contradiction within the belief system of Mormonism, which permits the isolation or compartmentalization of conflicting evidence or concepts. Still another example of contradiction is the fact that Christian Science Church has known for many years that though Mary Baker Eddy spoke vigorously against doctors and drugs, as well as vigorously affirming the unreality of pain, suffering, and disease, she herself was frequently attended in her declining years by doctors, received injections of morphine for the alleviation of pain, wore glasses, and had her teeth removed when they became diseased. However, despite this, the Christian Science Church insists upon the validity of Mrs. Eddy's teachings, which deny the very practices Mrs. Eddy herself exemplified. Here is a classic example of isolation, which might justly come under the heading of Physician, Heal Thyself. It would be possible to point out many other instances of psychological aberration in the belief systems of the major cults, but it is apparent that we are confronted with those whom the Apostle Paul described as victims of the master psychologist and propagandist of the ages, described by our Lord as the prince of this world, and by the Apostle Paul as the God of this age, the one who by the sheer force of his antagonism to the truth of divine revelation in the person of Jesus Christ has psychologically blinded the minds of those who believe not the gospel, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. This, of course, is not only a psychological blindness, but a spiritual blindness brought about by the isolation of man from God through the rebellion of human nature and the repeated violation of divine law. These are factors which cannot be ignored, for they are direct reflection of the forces which from the heavenlies dominate the world in which we live. Ephesians 6, verse 10 through 12. The psychological conditioning process. To conclude our observations in this seldom considered area of cultic analysis, let us consider examples of just how the cult systems of Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, and Christian Science condition their adherents to respond to the outside world of unbelievers. In the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, the literature of the Watchtower is replete with examples of a psychological conditioning which elicits a definite pattern of religious reflexes in response to a given stimuli. As Pavlov's dog salivated at the sound of a bell which represented food, so a true Jehovah's Witness will spiritually and emotionally salivate whenever the Watchtower rings the conditioning bell of Russellite theology. The example which I believe best demonstrates this is taken in context from Watchtower publications and speaks for itself. In Christendom, as surprising as it may seem to some, the false religious teachings create traditions, and commands of men are both directly and indirectly responsible for the physical and spiritual miseries of the poor, notwithstanding Christendom's showy display of charity. Christendom's pretended interest in the poor is sheer hypocrisy. Her priests have done violence to my law, and have profaned my holy things. Her princes in the midst thereof are like wolves, ravening the prey to shed blood and to destroy souls, that they may get dishonest gain. And her prophets have daubed them with untempered mortar, seeing false visions in divining lies unto them, saying, Thus says Jehovah, when Jehovah hath not spoken. The people of the land have used oppression and exercised robbery. Yea, they have vexed the poor and needy, and have oppressed the sojourners wrongfully. O wicked Christendom, why have you forsaken God's clean worship? Why have you joined forces and become part of Satan's wicked organization that oppresses the people? Why have you failed to show concern for the poor, as Jehovah commands? The little charitable help the poor get from Christendom is like the crumbs that beggar Lazarus picked up from the rich man's table while the dog licked his ulcerous sores. Neither the crumbs nor the licking remedied the beggarly condition. Only Jehovah can effect a rescue. How comforting, then, for the dejected, downtrodden people of the earth to learn that there is one higher than the highest of Christendom's moguls. Yes, Jehovah, the Almighty, hears the cries of the half-dead ones, and in hearing he answers their prayers, and sends his good Samaritans to the rescue, even the witnesses who are despised by Christendom. Haters of God and his people are to be hated, but this does not mean that we will take any opportunity of bringing physical hurt to them in the spirit of malice or spite, for both malice and spite belong to the devil, whereas pure hatred does not. We must hate in the truest sense, which is to regard with extreme and active aversion, to consider as loathsome, odious, filthy, to detest. Surely any haters of God are not fit to live on his beautiful earth. The earth will be rid of the wicked, and we shall not need to lift a finger to cause physical harm to come to them, for God will attend to that. But we must have a proper perspective of these enemies. His name signifies recompense to the enemies. Jehovah's enemies are recognized by their intense dislike for his people and the work these are doing, for they would break it down and have all of Jehovah's Witnesses sentenced to jail or concentration camps if they could. Not because they have anything against the witnesses personally, but on account of their work. They publish blasphemous lies and reproach the holy name of Jehovah. Do we not hate those who hate God? We cannot love those hateful enemies, for they are fit only for destruction. We utter the prayer of the psalmist. How long, O God, shall the adversary reproach? Shall the enemy blaspheme thy name forever? Why drawest thou back thy hand, even thy right hand? Pluck it out of thy bosom and consume them. Psalm 74, verse 10 and 11. We pray with intensity and cry out this prayer for Jehovah to delay no longer and plead that his anger be made manifest. O Jehovah, God of hosts, be not merciful to any wicked transgressors. Consume them in wrath. Consume them so that they shall be no more. Psalm 59, verse 4 through 6, and verse 11 through 13. These are the true sentiments, desires, and prayers of the righteous ones today. Are they yours? How we despise the workers of iniquity and those who would tear down God's organization. O Jehovah, let them be put to shame and dismayed forever. Yea, let them be confounded and perish, that they may know that thou alone, whose name is Jehovah, art the Most High over all the earth. Psalm 83, verse 9 through 18. The near neighbors of Judah have been the opposers of the Israelites right from the time when refusal was given by them to supply provisions to Israel as they journeyed to the Promised Land. Moab hired Balaam to curse Israel. They had much contempt for Jehovah's people and prided themselves in their own lofty city, her counterpart today being that rich, lofty city, the mighty religious organization standing for the whole of Satan's organization. The modern-day Moabites are the professing Christians whose words and actions are as far removed from Christianity and true worship of Jehovah as Moab was removed from true worship in the covenant of Jehovah. Jehovah had warned Moab of his proposed punishment for her iniquity and opposition. The modern-day Moabites have opposed Jehovah's Witnesses with a hatred not born of righteousness, but from the devil and against all righteousness. Their hatred for God's true people increases as they see upon us the very plain evidence of Jehovah's favor in the obvious disfavor they themselves are in. They put forth every effort to prevent the people of goodwill from entering the new world. They are richer than Jehovah's Witnesses in material things, and with it they have much pride and arrogance. The modern-day Moabites will be brought low, for Jehovah has completely finished with them. Hear just a part of the punishment. For in this mountain will the hand of Jehovah rest, and Moab shall be trodden down in his place, even as straw is trodden down in the water of the dunghill. He shall spread forth his hands in the midst thereof, as he that swimmeth spreadeth forth his hands to win. But Jehovah will lay low his pride together with the craft of his hands. It is a sure thing that one cannot have much pride left when one is being pressed down into a manure pile, showing the utter contempt Jehovah has for modern-day Moab, keeping her wallowing in the mire of shame. For thou hast made of a city a heap of a fortified city, a ruin, a palace of strangers, to be no city. it shall never be built. He hath put down them that dwell on high, the lofty city. He layeth it low, even to the ground. He bringeth it even to the dust. The foot shall tread it down, even the feet of the poor, and the steps of the needy. When this happens, what a tremendous change will take place. The tables will be turned. Brought down will be the lofty, from dwelling on high as the great, high, influential ones of this world, to the lowest possible place imaginable, so low and degraded they can only be compared to being trampled underfoot by the poor like straw in a manure heap. Christendom's lofty looks, boastful words, bragging tongue, our superior attitude toward the holy word of God, her trust in idols, men, and riches, such as belong to this world, will not provide her with security or any safety from Jehovah's storm and blast. They have no defense nor disgrace. Christendom's defenses are of no value, but Jehovah's Witnesses have a strong city, and this is something to sing about. There are millions who want a safe place and are in need of security. Let them know we have a strong city. Thou shalt call thy wall salvation, and thy gates praise. Isaiah 60, verse 18. Only God's kingdom offers such protection and salvation, for inside the city one is safe. Those desiring salvation must make for God's organization and find entrance into it, and remain there permanently. God has been grossly misrepresented by the clergy. If this statement is true, then that alone is proof conclusive that the clergy do not in fact represent God and Christ, but do represent God's enemy, the devil. If the Bible plainly proves that the doctrines they teach are wrong, and their course of action is wrong, then the most that can be said in extenuation of their wrongful teachings and their wrongful course of action is that they have been misled by the evil and seductive influence of Satan, the enemy of God. If the doctrines taught and the course taken by the clergy differ from that which is declared in the Word of God, then the clergy are in no wise safe guides for the people and should no longer be followed by the people. These doctrines originated with the devil. They have long been taught by his representatives. The clergy have been his instruments, freely used to instill these false doctrines into the minds of men. Whether the clergy have willingly done so or not does not alter the fact. If they have now learned that they are wrong, they should be eager to get the false thought out of the minds of the people. They do not take such course. The clergy have at all times posed as the representatives of God on earth. Satan overreached the minds of these clergymen and injected into their minds doctrines, which doctrines the clergy have taught the people concerning Jesus and his sacrifice. These doctrines have brought great confusion. The apostles taught the truth, but it was not long after their death until the devil found some clergyman wise in his own conceit who thought he could teach more than the inspired apostles. The clergy are willingly or unwillingly the instruments in the hands of the god of this world, Satan, the devil, who has used them to blind the minds of the people, to prevent the people from understanding God's great plan of salvation and reconciliation. The clergy of Christendom are obviously the villains and are the object of pure hatred. Just how pure hatred differs from good old-fashioned hatred, the Watchtower never gets around to explaining, but it is clear that Christendom, all historic communions, led by the allegedly corrupt clergy, has foisted the satanically conceived Trinity doctrine and the doctrines of hell and eternal punishment upon the unsuspecting masses of mankind. Clergymen are therefore always suspect, and their theology is to be regarded as untrustworthy and inspired by Satan. Is it any wonder that the usually calm and detached Stanley High, writing in the Reader's Digest of June 1940, could state, "Jehovah's Witnesses hate everybody and try to make it mutual. Jehovah's Witnesses make hate a religion." The doctrines of hell and eternal punishment, which stimulate fear of judgment, are unreasonable and not in accord with the Watchtower concept of the character of God. Therefore, it and the doctrine of the Trinity are satanic in origin, and all must be rejected and hated as false. What the Watchtower does in essence is attach polemic significance to certain common theological terms: Holy Trinity, deity of Christ, hell, eternal punishment, Christendom, immortal soul, etc. Thus, every time these terms are mentioned by anyone, the reflex action on the part of the Jehovah's Witnesses is instantaneous and hostile. If we couple this with the Watchtower's heavy emphasis upon the fulfillment of prophecy and a distorted eschatology, the sense of urgency they radiate about Armageddon, which they believe will solve all these problems by annihilating the clergy and all organized religion, then begins to make sense, and the reason for their actions becomes clear. When dealing with the average Jehovah's Witness, this entire pattern of preconditioning must be understood so that the Christian can avoid, where possible, direct usage of terms that will almost certainly evoke a theologically conditioned reflex and sever the lines of communication. Another important point where Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned is the fact that an intricate part of their belief system is the conviction that Christians will always attack Jehovah's Witnesses on a personal as well as a religious level. Hence, the witnesses readily assume a martyr or persecution complex the moment any antagonism is manifested toward Russell, Rutherford, their theology, the Watchtower, or themselves. It is apparently a comfortable, somewhat heroic feeling to believe that you are standing alone against the massed forces of the devil's organization, a Watchtower synonym for Christendom. And this illusion is made to seem all the more real when unthinking Christians, unfortunately, accommodate the witnesses by appearing overly aggressive toward the Watchtower theology or the witnesses personally. In the light of Jehovah's Witnesses' insistence upon pure hatred, one wonders how they live with their own New World Translation of Matthew 5, verse 43 and 44, which read, "You heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. However, I say to you, continue to love your enemies and pray for those persecuting you, that you may prove yourselves sons of your Father who is in the heavens." The Watchtower then does not hesitate to accuse the clergy and Christendom of provoking all kinds of evil. In fact, they have not hesitated to suggest that Christendom encouraged and did nothing to prevent the two great world wars. Had Christendom chosen to do so, she could easily have prevented World Wars I and II. Some of the basic motivations of the Watchtower are clearly seen in stark contrast with the teachings of Holy Scripture and reveal that there is more than a spiritual disorder involved. Indeed, there exist deep psychological overtones which cannot be considered healthy in any sense of the term. Whereas Jehovah's Witnesses are occupied with Armageddon, the theocracy, the end of the ages, and pure hatred, the Mormons have quite different psychological and theological emphases. At the very core of Mormon theology, there is a tremendous emphasis upon authority as it is invested in the priesthood, rituals, and symbols presided over by the hierarchy of the Mormon Church. Mormons are taught from their earliest days that the priesthood has the key to authority, and that one of the marks which identifies the restoration of the true Church of Jesus Christ on earth is the fact that this priesthood exists and perpetuates that authority. A devout Mormon will wear symbolic underclothing which perpetually reminds him of his responsibility and duties as a Mormon. When this is coupled with Mormonism's tremendous emphasis upon baptism for the remission of sins, tithing, and voluntary missionary service, it is seen to bind its followers into a tight, homogeneous circle, escape from which, apart from severe spiritual as well as economic penalties, is virtually impossible. Every Mormon is indoctrinated with the concept that his is the true Christian religion, or to use their terms, the restoration of Christianity to earth. The secret rites in the Mormon temples, the rituals connected with baptism for the dead, and the secret handshakes, signs, and symbols bind the average Mormon and his family into what might be called, in psychological terms, the in-group. Apart from acceptance by this group, the average Mormon can find no peace, or for that matter, community status or prestige. Instances of discrimination against Mormons who have experienced true Christian conversion are not infrequent in Mormon-dominated areas, where a man can lose his business very easily by incurring the disfavor of the Mormon Church. The social welfare program of the Mormons is another excellent inducement to Mormons to remain faithful, since if the breadwinner of the family is injured, loses his job, or dies, the church undertakes the care and support of his family. So effective is this work that during the Great Depression of the 1930s, no Mormon families went hungry, and no soup kitchens or breadlines disfigured the domain of Mormondom. The Mormons also conscientiously invoke the biblical principle of helping each other. They lend to each other, work for each other, and cooperate toward the common goal of bringing restored Christianity to the masses of mankind. These and other forces make Mormonism a family-centered religion which ties the faith of the church to the indissoluble bonds of family unity and loyalty. This forges an incredibly complex system of pressures and intertwining values over which is superimposed the theological structure of the Mormon Church, which stands between the average Mormon and the attainment of exaltation or progression to godhood. See chapter on Mormonism for a discussion of this. With such great psychological, economic, and religious forces concentrated upon him, it is a courageous person indeed who shakes off these varied yokes and steps into the freedom of a genuine experience with the Son of God. But a growing number are doing just this, as the Spirit of God continues to call out the church, which is Christ's body. Christian Science, unlike the two other cults we have considered, is neither interested in bestowing godhood, Mormonism, on its adherents, nor pushing the eschatological panic button of Armageddon, Jehovah's Witnesses. Christian Science is an ingenious mixture of first-century Gnostic theology, 18th-century Hegelian philosophy, and 19th-century idealism, woven into a redefined framework of Christian theology, with an emphasis upon the healing of the body by the highly questionable practice of denying its objective material reality. In Christian Science, there is a complete separation between the objective world of physical reality, matter, and the spiritual world of supernatural existence, mind. Mrs. Eddy taught that man as God's idea is already saved with an everlasting salvation. Hence, it is unnecessary for Christian Scientists to think of themselves as sinners in need of a salvation they believe is already theirs by virtue of the fact that man is already saved, because he is a reflection of the divine mind. However, in Christian Science, there are disturbing psychological aberrations. Mrs. Eddy demanded of her followers that they abstain from any critical contact with the non-spiritual elements of the illusory material world. She forbade the reading of obnoxious literature, lest Christian Scientists become convinced that the physical body and its diseases, suffering, and inevitable death were real. There is in Christian Science a subconscious repression, a conscious putting out of one's mind certain things which are disconcerting to the entire configuration of psychological patterns of conditioning. Christian Scientists are conditioned to believe in the non-existence of the material world, even though their senses testify to its objective reality. They continually affirm that matter has no true existence, and thus, in a very real sense, entertain a type of religious schizophrenia. One side of their personality testifies to the reality of the material world and its inexorable decay, while the conditioning process of Christian Science theology hammers relentlessly to suppress this testimony and affirm that the only true reality is spiritual or mental. In Margaret Mitchell's classic novel, Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara, the heroine, when confronted with the harsh realities of life in the wake of the Civil War, repeatedly states, "I'll think about that tomorrow," as if not thinking about it today would eliminate the reality of its claim at the moment. When working with sensory data, Christian Scientists totally disassociate their religious convictions, for if they did not, they would not continue to feed, clothe, or house their bodies. But in still another sense, they attempt to master the all too obvious frailties of the body by the application of a religion which denies the material reality of that body. A psychologist of the behaviorist school, in one sense, does the same thing. In the office, he may talk about conditioning and may associate everything, including his home, with mechanistic psychology. However, at home, he still loves his wife and children and doesn't respond in that same manner. This is one of the chief reasons why Christian Scientists sometimes appear to be almost immune to the conviction of personal guilt as a result of sin. Guilt implies the threat of judgment, and a standard which is the basis of that judgment. Hence the reality of the concept of sin, which is transgression of the law of God. Christian Scientists desperately want only a good world, a pleasant place full of happiness, life, love, and security. This they can have only if they deny the empirical evidence of the opposites of those concepts. In effect, they affirm the reality of good at the expense of the antithesis of good, as if by denying the existence of evil, one had annihilated evil. There can be no doubt that there is selective perception in the mind of the Christian Scientist, which enables him to select those things which are of a metaphysical nature, disassociate them from the sense perception of the physical world, and still maintain his idealistic philosophy and Gnostic theology. This he accomplishes by repressing or suppressing any evidence to the contrary. By following Mrs. Eddy's advice and avoiding what she would call obnoxious literature, that is, evidence which controverts the idealism of the Christian Science philosophy, Christian Scientists avoid facing the damaging data of physical reality. It is in effect an act of unconscious suppression utilized in order to escape the data. Concluding our thoughts in this area, we might say that in the kingdom of the cults, we are actually seeing a mosaic of abnormal conditioned behavior patterns that express themselves in a theological framework, utilizing Christian terms perverted by redefinition and represented as new insight, when in truth they are only old errors with new faces. The defense mechanisms on a psychological level are apparent when one considers the background and vocabulary of the cult systems. There exists, beyond a question of a doubt, an abnormal behavior syndrome operating in the mentality of most cultists, which causes the cultist, in the case of Christian Scientists, to build his theological system upon a preconditioned and artificially induced criterion of evaluation, that is, the divine mission and inspiration of Mary Baker Eddy. In the case of other cultists, the names Joseph Smith, Pastor Russell, Brigham Young, or any other cult authority figure could be supplied, and the conditioned reflex would be virtually the same. There are many more observations which could be made, but space will not permit. It is my hope that in observing and analyzing the facets of cult behavior patterns already discussed, the reader may obtain a deeper insight and appreciation of the psychological structure of cultism as it continues to influence a growing segment of professing Christendom, which is ill prepared for the subtleties and dangers of such psychological and theological deviations.